Dr. Perz is a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law. He's also a faculty affiliate with the School of Natural Resources and Environment and the Center for Latin American Studies here at UF. Dr. Perz has conducted research in the Amazon on the social ecological impacts of infrastructure and the political ecology of environmental governance. He's received quite a lot of funding, more than 17 million. From NASA, NSF, USAID, and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And in 2015, he was selected as the UF International Educator of the Year for senior faculty. And I actually have known Dr. Perz for quite some time. He was on my doctoral committee while I was working on my PhD. So we've been working together in a variety of capacities for a while. So today, Dr. Perz is going to be talking about participatory action research for conservation and development, experiences from the Amazon, which has been, from what I understand, a collaborative effort. And I believe he has a number of his colleagues and collaborators here with him today to chime in on the presentation. So thank you for being here, Dr. Perz.
All right, thank you, Allison. It's great to see you all, have this opportunity to chat. I'm going to share screen. And we'll start at the beginning. As Allison said, this is an eminently collaborative effort. I'm going to be drawing on a long manuscript that we have recently submitted to the journal Sustainability, in which I served as the de facto coordinator. And all of those other names you see on the screen right now were involved in one or another of these case studies that I'll be talking about. Time prevents us from talking about them all. So with apologies to some of my collaborators who are here, we're going to mention some of these cases, and then we're going to go into detail about some of the other cases. But in the cases where we can't go into detail, I'm happy to take more questions, okay? So we'll start at the big global scale. You've heard about the UN development, the Sustainable Development Goals. They have been subject to some reviews in recent years. Many of those reviews talking about implementation emphasize the importance of knowledge co-management in ensuring implementation is effective. For me and many other people, co-management implies knowledge co-production. Co-production can then lead to knowledge mobilization to do applied things with regard to conservation and development. And this has sent a lot of people thinking about how do you do that, okay? And one way to think about how you might do this is an established tradition in the social sciences called participatory action research. So that's a label I'm going to attach to what follows, even if we don't necessarily think about what we do in those terms from the beginning. But the basic idea of PAR, as it's called, is to feature stakeholder participation with researchers in that knowledge co-production at every stage of the research process, while also highlighting the contributions of stakeholders in the very beginning, the framing of research. What research is going to be done on ought to be reflective of the goals and priorities of stakeholders, so then there's a direct path to acting on the research. So this is where the action part comes in. So this is one way of framing a response to some of these critiques of the degree to which UN development goals are actually being implemented. So we're going to talk about PAR. Okay? As it turns out, there's a whole bunch of different research literatures that I think speak to PAR in one way or another. And you can see this big long list that I've put on the screen. We've also already mentioned knowledge management and mobilization. Some of these others you're probably familiar of. I think most everybody here probably knows what transdisciplinarity is, but there's others in terms of TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, asking indigenous people and others what they think and how they've been engaged in practices. There's a rapidly growing literature on the decolonization of knowledge and research, how science from Western societies is meeting quote unquote non-Western societies, which mean lots of different things. There's a whole literature on the democratization of knowledge, which really means including lots of people, whatever their identities, backgrounds, countries, beliefs, in doing research, okay? There's a fair amount of literature on knowledge exchange, which usually means the exchange of knowledge from different kinds of knowledge funds, from different kinds of stakeholders and researchers. You've probably heard about citizen science. This has a large literature in the United States, but it's emerged in other countries as well. Basically, the idea is we don't need researchers to go do research. Stakeholders will go do it themselves. there's more to it than that, but that's the basic idea. And then finally, that term knowledge co-production, which is where you're going through the research process with stakeholders and researchers, and they're co-producing knowledge by doing some of these other things, but also especially in the moment of interpreting findings. What do we make of the findings, and therefore what do we do with the findings? This is sort of the shorthand for what co-production is about. I'm not going to get into a lot more detail about these. These are just buzzwords that are out there, and they all correspond to literatures that you're hereby invited and welcome to look up if you want to know more about different traditions of PAR, okay? Here we're going to offer a brief framework for thinking about this that at least informs my thinking as I've sort of reflected on what my collaborators have been up to these many past years, which is to think about PAR as a process, okay? So research has a process, it has a lot of different stages, and one way to think about PAR is to think about the respective contributions of researchers and stakeholders at each of those different stages. And I want to make the suggestion that one thing to strive for is to see and look for ways to make those contributions complementary. And in many ways, they already are, but to be intentional about this. I've done some work on collaboration, and what I and many others have found is if you bring people together and they have different experiences, different capacities, different knowledge funds, and so forth, they can often be viewed as complementary. And if you take those puzzle pieces and find a way to fit them together, you can do things together, collaborating, that you could not do on your own. And so I think this informs some of the spirit of this framework for thinking about PAR. So with apologies for the screaming colors, I didn't have time to change this. If you go through the second row of boxes, that's one way to think about the research process, right? We start at the left with defining a problem. We follow the arrows heading right through development of a methodology. Then we go collect the data, we analyze the data, draw some conclusions. Then we might share our knowledge, and then we might finally at the far right apply it. But if you look at the first row, we look at potential stakeholder contributions. And if you look at the bottom row, you look at potential researcher contributions. Again, time prevents me from going into details about all of this, but the point is if you have a truly participatory and action-oriented process for research at every stage of the way, stakeholders as well as researchers are active agents in providing inputs and making decisions and influencing what happens and what we do with the findings that we get out of research. Ideally, PAR has active stakeholders and researchers collaborating together at all of these stages. We can think about the stages in other ways, but the point is they're both active agents at all the stages of the process, okay? All right, so I'm going to pivot to the Amazon. And here I'll tell a little fairy tale. Once upon a time, the Amazon and its people were the object of research by researchers, okay? Those days are long over, and it's probably true in other parts of the world where many of you are from and where many of you probably work, all right? Because what happened is in the Amazon is many governments engaged in a variety of top-down development project planning. Those projects opened roads and built other things that attracted populations to newly accessible natural resources. They ran into other stakeholders who were already there, like fishers and indigenous people and forest extractivists, which then led to a variety of conflicts over resources, not just land, but forest products and fisheries and what have you. That in turn led to a lot of mobilization by these different stakeholders. And over time, they have figured out that researchers can actually be useful allies. I've heard indigenous groups talk about pet scientists. They want to have their pet scientists that will help them support their agenda to confront the state to achieve their objectives. So what is going on now is that is increasingly stakeholders, however defined, who are recognizing researchers as allies and then proceeding in a more participatory way in defining what research priorities should be pursued. So stakeholders in the Amazon now routinely demand research on certain topics that fit their strategic goals. Whether it's in theoretical debate, whether policymakers are worried about it, stakeholders in the region are themselves seeking out researchers and looking for ways to get them to do research on stuff that they want, that the stakeholders want, okay? So stakeholders increasingly drive research agendas. They increasingly seek to actively participate in these other phases of the research process for knowledge co-production because they have things that they want to see achieved, often in the name of territorial management, environmental governance, conservation and sustainable development, whatever the term is, it often has a lot to do with sustainability. Okay? So with that, I'm going to continue my pivot in this manuscript that we have drafted. And the reason for all the names in there is that it became evident to me, looking at my many collaborators, that they have pursued various different approaches to PAR in different parts of the mostly Western Amazon. So what we do in the manuscript is report 6 different cases. And in the process of trying to figure out what order they go, I at least perceive that there are 3 kinds of experiences that these cases could be described as. One is kind of the classic participatory data collection for co-productive knowledge. And we have 3 cases of that, and we're going to talk about 2 of them in some detail today. Another kind of experience has more to do with composing and sustaining an environmental monitoring program to achieve certain kinds of goals. And we have a couple cases of that, and we're going to talk about one in a little more detail. And then finally, there are some innovative models of knowledge exchange that are trying to be more responsive to the particular conditions of the Amazon, where change is very fast, access to knowledge is very unequal, and there's a lot of demand for knowledge like now. Okay, so there's innovative models that some of us have pursued. To that end, I'm going to ask Marlise Arteaga to join me at a couple points along as we go through these cases. Marlise is a current SNRE graduate student. She is also one of the stars among the graduate students on our GEA project. GEA stands for Governance and Infrastructure in the Amazon. There are many other GEA people here, so they are well aware of what Marlise and many other people have been doing in the Upper Madeira watershed in the Amazon. So Marlise is going to chime in, so you don't have to listen to me the whole time, okay? So we're going to start with the first case that actually comes from Colombia and stems from the dissertation research of one of my former graduate students, Marta Rosero, who worked with some indigenous and traditional groups over there. Many of you probably do this too. You recognize that many local peoples depend directly on natural resources for their livelihoods. Many of them are threatened by external drivers of change like climate, like political instability and other kinds of things. And in some quarters of the policy community out there, but also among researchers and stakeholders, then there's been this pivot from a focus on, oh, local peoples are vulnerable and they need help and they become dependent on outsiders, to a focus on resilience, where we view local peoples as active agents who often have deep histories of engaging in certain practices that have seen them through, that really need to be paid attention to. And they are very valuable for adaptation to change, including rapid change. So this is what Marta began to discuss with certain groups of local peoples in Colombia for her dissertation. But she quickly perceived that it's not quite that simple. It's not as simple as a pivot from vulnerability to resilience and thinking about adaptation, because resilience is situated in Western dualistic ontologies. The old Aristotelian logic that we like to draw differences between things because that allows us to a more refined analytical perspective on the world. The problem in the context of thinking about local peoples is that these kinds of dualistic ontologies were often used by colonizers to justify differences, often racist ones, with the colonized, and therefore to justify subjugation. So people have increasingly recognized that indigenous groups in many parts of the world, many other non-Western or traditional societies have very different kinds of ontologies, relational ontologies that may recognize differences, but also highlight the relationships between different kinds of ontological categories. In this case, between the human, the so-called natural, and even the spiritual, as having crucial relationships that drive particular practices that allow societies to endure even through periods of change. So you want to understand resilience among indigenous peoples and other traditional groups, you have to pay attention to their ontologies. And so this was a key input in what made this project very participatory. So Marta worked with the Dagua Afro-Colombian people, as well as the Naza indigenous people in a province of Colombia. Both were very interested in pursuing self-evaluations of the extent to which they were still pursuing their traditional practices that stemmed from their relational ontologies, okay? So this then drove the research. How do you do this? Well, she had to then pursue something like a PAR evaluation that did bring in the elements that we know and love about resilience. So thinking about memory and adaptive capacity and this other stuff that's out in the literature, but then also bringing in these elements of these relational ontologies. So it was more relevant and grounded. Time really prevents me from going into detail about some of these very fascinating practices, the ombligado, or the naval ritual, which these groups highlighted in the case of the Dagua, and also these rituals of harmonization with about family agricultural plots. Ask me later, I can come back to this, or if Martha is here, she can explain it herself, okay? In any event, the locals contributed to the evaluation and the design. Martha then pursued a validation of the protocol. It was sort of her protocol, but it was really all of their protocols, okay? And then administered it through walkthroughs and interviews and these kinds of social science methods. But the rest of the process continued to be participatory insofar as she returned the findings to the communities for discussion and reflection. Because this was all part of a planning process. Remember, the research was just one phase of a longer process. By design, the whole point was to pursue a reflection and think about how to deal with future changes. So there were some key findings, namely that people were not universally following these age-old practices that had seen them through before. And so that came as a surprise to some of the elders and the leaders in these communities. And so that provided a basis for downstream action. A second case I'm just going to briefly mention comes from a recent SNRE PhD, Andre Balduan, who's back in Bolivia in the field with limited internet access today, I'm told. She actually worked in an area in central Bolivia, the Tipnis region, which is both a protected area and an indigenous reserve. It has been contested for the resources there. Indigenous peoples came to her with very specific priorities that then turned into a small project funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And again, I can talk about that more if people have questions later. With that, I want to take a drink of water and let Marlise talk for a few minutes about something called a community of practice and learning. Marlise, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
Thank
you're
you.
up.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm very happy to be here and share a little bit of what I have been doing in the last 4 years. This is the creation and consolidation of the Upper Madeira Community of Practice and Learning, which is part of a bigger project, as Steve already mentioned. It's part of the governance and infrastructure in the Amazon project. So basically, what we mean when we talk about the Upper Madeira region. The Upper Madeira region is a region that is between Bolivia and Brazil, and is in the Madeira River Basin. This Madeira River Basin is one of the biggest tributaries of the Amazon and Amazon in general, and it's really, really important. And basically here, you can see this is the Upper Madeira region where we work. It is between Bolivia and Brazil. And in this area, 2 big dams have been built already in the Brazilian side, and 2 dams are planned to build in the Bolivian side. I mean, one in the Bolivian side and one is binational. So because of that, we see that many communities, local communities, have been facing a lot of challenges. And one of the biggest challenges is the gap of information that they have in this area. So basically, we put together, we call different kind of the stakeholders, communities, universities, NGOs in this area. And back in 2019, we did a workshop where we evaluate and ask what they need in order to go forward and in order to find or to fill those gaps. So basically, the construction of the community of practice has 5 different phases, but in this case, we're going to focus on the phase 4, which is the co-generation of knowledge and learning. And basically in this area, after we did this evaluation, we talked directly with the communities and with the partners and asked them what they want and how they need for their territories. And based on that information, we start to generating activities, programmatic activities in order to go forward. And from that, we identify different activities like the transdisciplinary research that we did with students there. So the local communities, they express knowledge needs to grassroots organizations, and grassroots organizations work with universities and NGOs too. So we create this space with all the people involved, all the organizations involved would talk openly. We start to building this trust among them. And after that, we did this transdisciplinary research with 5 students in local Amazonian universities. These students have different kind of focus. We build these multidisciplinary groups. And here you can see some students doing the field work, but the students weren't alone. They have like a support group of mentors and tutors from the local universities, the local NGOs, and also from here, from the UF, from people from the GEA project, that they help the students to gather the information, to do the analysis. But the important thing is, like, through the whole process, we were always in touch with the communities. So the communities were the ones who say, okay, we agree in this research, or maybe we need to change this and that. And every step that we did, we go back to the communities, and the communities gave us their feedback. And I think that is the important part, the key part of the results that we got, because we always keep in touch with the communities and with their needs.
Thank you, Marlise. We are going to circle back to Marlise. You may have noticed we have 6 cases, but 7 experiences, and this is the one that has a 2-part story. So Marlise will tell us about the other part in a little bit. We're going to move on to environmental monitoring. Case 4, it seems like the even-numbered cases are the ones I'm just going to mention. We also had a case from the Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve, which is quite famous in Brazil as a sustainable use area, that we have colleagues at the Federal University of Acre. Galia Celaya is with us, as well as a forest ecologist. And they wanted to work with communities in the ResX, as we call it, on the question of forest health, which is a way to talk to local peoples about ecosystem services, which are often kind of abstract and, what are the bees doing and where is the carbon type stuff. You talk to people about forest health, they can connect with that because they can think about their own health and their children's health. And so this experience sought to train people in how to conduct forest monitoring on forest health by giving them skills that were also valuable in job markets beyond environmental monitoring. So this is a way of trying to align conservation goals with those of rural communities who are watching their livelihoods be threatened, but also to find ways to qualify those communities to participate in payment for ecosystem services programs. Again, you circle back and ask me questions about this if you like later. The other experience in environmental monitoring that we're going to talk about was a network for environmental monitoring, especially climatic monitoring and emergency management of extreme climatic events in the southwestern Amazon. It comes from something called MAP. MAP is a couple things. One, it is a tri-national frontier named after Madre de Dios Acre and Pando, which is this tri-national frontier in the southwestern Amazon. MAP is also a tri-national network or social movement that emerged in the region that sought to encourage a broad public participation in regional environmental planning as well as governance. Okay. What happened is that participation in the MAP initiative grew over time, and as a result, MAP started to spin off what they called the mini MAPs, which were these working groups on specific topics. And mini MAP risk management was one of those. And so we have a few people from that network on the manuscript, but they are a few of many people who are working in that. What has happened in the southwestern Amazon, this may sound like a familiar story, is that as climate change is proceeding, we're seeing the climatic regime historically documented become destabilized. And so you get more and more extreme climatic events. So you get more floods in the Amazon, and you can see the number of years over the last decade or two where there have been major floods, including records getting set and then broken in the early 2010s, tens or hundreds of thousands of people being affected, thousands being displaced, estimates of property damage up to $1 billion. This is not a rich part of the world. Okay, so these are really, really basic assets that people possess that are being threatened or destroyed. So here are some images. The ones on the left are from the 2006 flood. That's images from the regional capital in Acre. The images on the right are from very well-established, long-established towns that are now being flooded fairly regularly. That's Brasileia, a small town in Acre, okay? There are also droughts and fires in the Amazon, a humid tropical area where the rainforest is not supposed to be able to burn, but it does now, okay? So you have agriculturalists who set fires to their newly cleared plots. The fire provides fertility to the soil and all of that. In drought years, the fires escape control, the fires go in the forest, and the fires burn the forest, okay? And you can see some estimates there from satellite data about how many hundreds of thousands of hectares of forests in this part of the region or part of the world that have been burned. This then mobilized a substantial response, okay, on the part of civil society to try and find ways to better manage this. And so Minimap risk management emerged among a variety of different stakeholders, including governments, even national ministries, many researchers who were involved in documenting weather changes and climatic changes, and crucially, civil defense. So you have firefighters, you have various portions of the military who are charged with organizing a response, whether that means you're evacuating people or you're fighting fires or whatever it may happen, whatever it may mean. So they began to organize regular tri-national meetings to figure out how better to coordinate monitoring and preparedness. Because in some cases, the firefighters from one side can get to the other side faster than the firefighters on that side of the border can, if it means fighting a fire or getting kids out of a school or something like that. So they began to draw on various data sources. So there's National Weather Service data on precipitation, but then there's other kinds of data from local monitoring stations about river levels. And then there's things like topographic maps that'll tell you which areas are going to get flooded and how badly and how high the water has to go and this kind of a thing. They also engaged in expeditions up rivers so they can install more environmental monitoring stations. So when the flood is on its way, you know farther in advance. And these became key elements of a real-time early warning system that they began to integrate and put together to then inform civil defense response. So this is what dealing with extreme climatic events looks like to minimize the loss of property and life and limb. Okay? There were parallel efforts, aside from flood preparedness, to think about how to manage fires and air quality from all the smoke and particulate matter, okay? So fire monitoring can be done, as many of you probably know, through infrared remote sensing, identification of hot pixels and things like that. They also went about installing air quality monitoring stations, especially around urban areas, to watch for high levels of particulate matter, okay? And then they began to disseminate all of this information via official government portals, but also just formation of WhatsApp groups and this kind of a thing. They discovered that there's a big premium on effective communication during extreme events, because it's during extreme events that things like cell phone service and internet are very likely to go out, right when you need them most. This then led them to talk to people like radio operators and install radios in local schools, and especially in rural areas where there's going to be concentration of population, and thereby forming a big network for communication that's a little bit more resilient than cell and internet. Okay. With that, I'm going to move into the last section, thinking about knowledge exchange. One experience that I've been involved in over the years is something called the knowledge exchange train. The basic idea here is to scale up and accelerate the dissemination of scientific knowledge, but also to foster exchanges between researchers and local people. So the notion is you have lots of researchers on different projects traveling around together and making stops as if along a train route in lots of communities to talk to lots of stakeholders all at the same time. So you can accelerate knowledge exchange that way. Just going to mention that because now I want to come back to Marlies, who has worked on a related model that's really built and improved on this, leveraging some of the experiences and findings from GIA. So Marlies.
Okay, I'm here. Thank you. So after we did the data collection and the co-production of knowledge, we didn't want to just have those results, right? We want to share those results, but with the communities, no, with academia or with local universities. So we learned about this model, the knowledge exchange train, and we decided to do something similar. During the period of the project, we did two of them, one in 2020 and the other in 2021. The first one was focused on having this knowledge exchange between communities in Brazil that had been already impacted by the dams and the Bolivian communities that have received some kind of impacts, but not in the same degree. So we want them to share their experiences. We create story life and many other stuff. And also we took advantage of this first event to reevaluate our agenda and also to adjust on what the community's needs were at that moment. So basically, we have the flexibility to rearrange many activities. For the last one, we really give back all the products that we create in the different activities that we had in the Upper Madeira Mosaic. For example, we have a group that work in the FPIC and Estatutos de Consentimiento Informado. This group worked really hard on different communities trying to build this consensus, this document that will help and give them the voice to the communities to decide what they want when they're in communities. And in this last knowledge exchange carreton, what we did was socialize all the products for the different communities and also give the opportunity to the communities to see what they think and how they could go forward. So in this last event, all the partners just commit to continue working in some areas and in other areas. So for now, the GEO project ends officially, but we as Upper Madeira Mosaic, we still have some specific groups that are still working, building on these previous information that we had. So basically, and also we participate in webinars in an international level and also with other groups like the Amazon Dams Network. And I think that we were very prolific, but again, the key for our success, I think, was this close connection with the communities and this building trust between the communities and between all the stakeholders. And it's why we got these amazing results, and all these partners are still working together at this point, even though the GEO project already ended.
Yeah, I just tried to capture some of the highlights from Marlise's efforts with their network, but we're scratching the surface here. So if you have more questions for Marlise, you want to hear more about the Upper Madeira or the GEO project, please ask us. So with that, we're going to wrap up our wall of information that we're throwing at you and just offer a couple of reflections. We did do some comparative analysis, and I have a couple of big scary tables at the very end of the manuscript and just a couple of reflections from that part. One is that, all of these PAR cases in the Amazon do show that stakeholders very often lead, or at least are actively collaborating in every stage of the research process. It's never really the case where they're just sitting around waiting for the researchers to make decisions and do stuff. This has been a very collaborative process, as I hope you've seen us highlight. In many cases, as we've tried to note, stakeholders were leading, especially the definition of what the projects were going to be about, what the research priorities were going to be, and this kind of a thing. And they were often very active in a leadership role in many other stages of the projects described. Okay, there's some variation about when they were leading and when they were just collaborating from one case to another, but there was often very active roles for stakeholders in these experiences. The other reflection is that, all of these efforts are seeking to improve environmental governance and improve conservation through protected areas and sustainable use areas, to support sustainable development through livelihoods and things like that. So there's a variety of different experiences here that have somewhat different models about how PAR can do that, whether it's just data collection or whether you're going to build a monitoring system, whether you're going to highlight knowledge exchange, or you're going to do more than one of those, okay? And in many of these cases, we're creating, or the collaborators in their networks are creating the conditions to improve the prospects for environmental governance and sustainability and these kinds of outcomes. But in a couple of cases where these experiences have gone on for a longer period of time, you've begun to see more implementation. You've begun to see planning being put into practice. You've begun to see changes in strategy. So sometimes these things take time to unfold, but they do unfold and go forward, as we saw in some of the longer standing cases like the mini-map risk management. And we're starting to see now in Martha's case, as well as in the Upper Madera Club. This is the last slide. So implications if you're a graduate student, I can't resist here. As we saw earlier, there's a whole bunch of different literatures related to PAR. So again, I just want to return to that for a moment. These are buzzwords that are out there, but they mean things to people and they have been put into practice. And so I encourage you to look at the literature about how these things have been implemented. We picked cases from the Amazon, but this stuff is going on all around the world in various different kinds of contexts, okay? And these different kinds of literatures each have their own insights. I'm not suggesting they're all saying the same thing, but I am suggesting that they point in their own ways toward ways in which research can be made more participatory, that stakeholders can show greater leadership in advancing their own agendas, which they often understand very well as they relate to resilience and sustainability, and that merits being supported. And a final insight, as I hope is evident from Marlise's presentation here, but also in the role of graduate students and former grads, is that this isn't just something for senior faculty after they get tenure or something. This is to do now, okay? It can be done, it should be done. Yes, collaboration takes time, but what we have seen over time is that the graduate students of today, like Marlise and Andrea and Martha and many others, who are engaging local stakeholders, become conservation professionals with deep ties, as Marlise emphasized, tomorrow. And those deep ties are often very important for sustaining collaborative efforts toward governance and these kinds of goals. These things do take time. Dissertations have a time-limited duration. I get the graduate school and their 5-year rule and all that, but it can be done if the commitment is there. So with that, oh yeah, last plug. I've written books on this stuff. So if you're interested, the first book is on other projects in the Amazon. The second book, it comes from other examples from around the world. And most of the chapters were written by principal investigators on NSF CNH projects, the big coupled natural and human systems projects, which are really all about integrating social science and ecological science, but then bringing in stakeholders in each case. Okay, so I lied. That is the last slide. We'll stop there. We've sort of raced through this on the theory that people would have questions. And so we've tried to leave you all some time to ask us questions. So I'm going to de-sharify screen and see if anybody has any questions for Marlise or myself or any of the other collaborators who might be here. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Stephen. That was really interesting. And I'm really glad actually that you brought up that last point about, grad students and junior faculty doing PAR. And I've definitely heard people be dissuaded, because of time and, all of these kinds of things. That was something I was going to ask you actually. So you beat me to that. So I'll go ahead and monitor the chat, but if anybody wants to ask a question, with their actual voice, that's also fine too.
So Orlando, is that a hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Perz. Thank you, Marlise, for the intervention. I was wondering, what is the biggest challenge to apply the PAR, and how you deal in your experience those challenges?
I don't know, Marlise, you want to try first? You want me to go?
I can try a couple of things. I think that first, time constraint is always a problem, and how you're going to overcome and try to, put together, your PhD dissertation plus you're working, like how you're working. Then the budget is also a big constraint because you want to include everyone, you want to work with everyone, you want to do a lot of activities, you want to be really participatory, but at the end of the day, if you don't have enough support, enough budget, you are not able to do it. But having saying that, I think that you can do the work if you really are committed to do it. And one thing that I guess this pandemic gave us is this online world that maybe we start to adapting, and we could see like we could have or be more efficient in meetings with people in different parts of the world. And that thing kind of help us, especially in the Upper Madeira. It helped us to reorganize because in the second part of the project, we were in the middle of the pandemic and we have to reorganize everything. And we took advantage of this new online world to trying to overcome many challenges that we face. And of course, it helped us to communicate a lot with the partners in the ground, because communication is key if you really want to have results in this kind of projects.
Yeah, I guess, Orlando, I would just add two things that I talked about a lot in my first book, which are issues that come up repeatedly and in my view do not get enough attention in the management literature when people talk about managing collaborative relationships. And the first of those is managing politics and inequalities, whether that means inequalities between researchers and stakeholders, or the changing political context in which we're often working. There are strategic practices to deal with these kinds of issues, but they have to be managed. They cannot be ignored or swept under the rug, because they will come up and they are disruptive. The other issue that I find needs more attention is just the question of uncertainty and surprises. We talked about, climate change itself leads to these extreme events that can that can change what a project is about. I've watched this happen. We couldn't have the meeting because there was a flood. I mean, there was an environmental surprise, if you will, that changed what we were going to do that day, but also forced everybody to reflect on what we were going to be doing in the next year, and it turned out the next decade. So I think surprises are a big deal. Galia, do you want to add something?
Yes, just from our experience in Chico Mendes, I think one of the challenges were to find the representatives of the communities to participate in our project, because usually happens that the leaders sometimes hinders the participation of the grassroots. So that was something that we had to work on, and we found a way, fortunately, but that calls, and that's the nice things about the participatory action research, that it opens opportunities to democratize, to have a more democratic society, because opens the doors for everyone to participate. The second thing was about the time allocation efficiency. People that were willing to participate in our projects were demanding like a very efficient agenda, so they will, that because they have to leave some activities to be present in our workshops, and that costs money sometimes, because they are losing money to come to our activities. So that's something to think about, because they really talk about how they are, what is the benefit of being there. So there should be a link with some potential benefits for them to be interested. The other experience was that we attracted young people. And basically, maybe because of the type of work we did, because we deal with GPS, we were measuring trees and so forth. So young people were willing to learn about the tools we were using, and they were looking they were looking ahead of just participating as to learn something. But for instance, to find a job or to become a technician and so forth. So that was a very, very nice experience to attract young to the market of the jobs, let's say. So that are some of the experiences we had.
Yeah, so Gali, I just put the article that you and Sabina led in the chat. If people are more interested in the recent work of you all in the Chico Mendes Reserve, you can see some of that in the publication that came out in Ecology and Society. I would just add one thing to what Gali has said is figuring out who to work with also proved to be gendered. That many women in these rural areas also had their own priorities and wanted to participate. But because in many populations, rural women are often working in relatively isolated conditions, they stay out in the campo on the farm. They often weren't represented in workshops. So I'm actually going to add another link to a recent literature review by Marianne Schmink and Marlise Arteaga on gender in the Amazon and how that plays out in how conservation in practice is done there. Bob, is that a hand up?
Yes, thank you, Stephen, Marlise, Galia. Very interesting. It seems like you are proposing almost a new paradigm for academia, and you make a case that academia changing the way it relates with research and knowledge and stakeholders can play a greater fulfill its social responsibility in terms of the SDGs, in terms of environmental justice. I guess I'm particularly curious about the role of academia, how you see that. Thinking about your case 5, for example, the mini-map environmental monitoring, I'm not sure there was research there. I mean, if you're monitoring fire pixels or weather data, that doesn't sound like a research question. And the reason I'm asking specifically on academia, because there are lots of really good NGO think tanks, and they produce a lot of valuable information. So what is the specific role of academia? What's our value added? And thinking also about Orlando's question about constraints, you know, how are the Amazonian universities constrained? Or, you know, are they motivated? And how can we further engage with them? So what's kind of how to get them into this new paradigm as well?
Well, I'll attempt half of an answer. I think in these different cases, the role of academia, if you want to put it in general terms, it has been a supporting, facilitating type of role. So in what Marlise was talking about, you're right, you get university students with their advisors trying to support research projects that are prioritized by communities. But you get into the more specific type elements, there's other ways in which academics or researchers, whether they're at universities or NGOs, might be facilitated. I think part of the role of researchers in academic institutions is to develop ideas, develop terminology, develop methods and proof of concept in a somewhat basic research type of mode, but then they can be applied. And so this is sort of the bridge that PAR can often provide. In mini-map risk management, there's been a lot of research and effort in universities that then gets adopted by NGOs once they kind of see the value of remote sensing or whatever the method of data collection is. And then it gets kind of applied in monitoring systems. So the modalities can be somewhat different depending on the technology, where the state of the field is with regard to certain kinds of methods. I don't know if Marlise, Gali, or others would like to complement.
I just wanted to tell you a story when we were working in the gathering the data and everything. For example, in this area, we identify, and also the communities identified, like there was a gap in the scientific information, specifically in this area. and the communities really request scientific information, because they have their, their experiences, their knowledge, but they couldn't, systematize everything. And whenever they have to go to the government and say, hey, these dams are really affecting our area, they say, oh, so where is the information? This is just you telling that, but we don't really have any supporting information. So the communities, specifically the Binational Committee, they start to get in touch with different universities because they were requesting this information. So I think that in our activity with the Upper Madeira Mosaic, I think that we, in some point, were able to fulfill this gap, because we, with this 5 research and with other activities, we produce this information, and now the communities have this information, because we didn't return just the thesis, the documents. We translate that into a more digestible information, like flyers, videos, books, and other kind of stuff. So the National Committee is using those documents to go and talk with local government now. So because now they have this information in their hands, saying, hey, these are the changes that our communities are facing, and we need to do that. So in this process, we could see, the necessity, how the intervention was, and how we traduce this academic knowledge into something that is more understandable, not just for the communities, but also for the decision makers. So, and I think that was cool, that was awesome, and I think is what researchers need to do their research.
So I want to be respectful of your time. There's one more question from Colin in the chat about the role of ecotourism centers and whether they can assist funding research in the area, or if they're being utilized as research stations, if anybody knows anything about that.
I don't offhand. I mean, I'm aware of like Los Amigos, and there's research stations, and then there's sort of ecotourism, that places that are often near protected areas and this kind of a thing, and you get kind of into multi-use type arrangements. It's an intriguing possibility, but I don't have, it's not among our cases, so I don't have a specific experience to draw on. But it's an interesting idea. I don't know if Marlise or Galia or others might want to comment, though.
Well, maybe it happens from once in a while, but it's not like a policy, a systematic, like a scheme. So it's something to explore, maybe. Talking about the universities, the local universities here, I think to make participatory action research, they are still depending on outside funding. That's my experience so far, because it requires not only the, let's say, the ideas and the methodologies, but also the resources, and that's something that they lack. So I think I have to say that universities still depends on international collaboration, and I don't know with the COVID how this situation will. I mean, it is maybe getting worse because the universities are having a hard time here.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, Marlise, Galia. Thank you so much for talking with us today. I think this was just great, very, very interesting, fascinating. So to everybody else in the seminar, keep your eye out for our flyer for next Monday. And then just keep in mind for the recording, if you want to follow up with any of the co-authors, I believe, Stephen, you had the emails all there in the presentation, right? Okay, so those are there if you have any follow-up questions. Otherwise, I will see you all next Monday. Thank you again.